Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Another video for you. As always, so much to talk about, much more to discuss than I'll have time for. But let's get into it and start focusing on some key issues. I want to do a very quick overview of at least what we think is the latest developments in terms of what's going on the ground. As always, my preface being that I'm not a military expert. I don't look at maps and try to make determinations about what kind of strategy is being pursued. But I do try to follow these things and read the opinions of others who are much more military minded than I am. And although I am generally pretty skeptical of all military information and analysis, especially when it comes out of the think tanks and policy centers in the United States and other parts of the empire. I do think it is worth paying attention to because there are a lot of reports. It's very difficult to get information that is reliable, that you can confirm on the ground, and so this is the best information that I can come across that has been confirmed. So let's discuss what comes out of the Institute for the Study of War, specifically where we are today, or I guess yesterday. That would be March 19th. 2022. I guess we could basically summarize it by saying that Russia's initial war plans have failed. I think it's probably fairly obvious to anybody who's watching the news and seeing the development of this war that Russia did not intend to get bogged down in the way that it has. They expected, it seems, a much quicker pace of progress in terms of taking cities and so forth. And I will just note, actually, that I just remembered that I think I misspoke in a previous video where I said that Russia had been occupying all the major cities or many of the major cities in Ukraine. This is, of course, not true. I guess what I meant to say, and I misspoke. It's what happens when you record live. But I guess what I probably meant to say is that Russia is fighting for and or surrounding and or committing resources to many, not all, many of the major cities of Ukraine. So you see, there are a number of cities where Russian forces have attempted to surround them, but do not have the resources to actually attack them. In any event, I definitely didn't mean to portray the idea that Russia has somehow made progress that it has not made. So anyway, thank you for the person who emailed me about that, just to remind me. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what at least some of the military experts seem to believe was Russia's primary initial objective. Let's call it phase one of this war. And that was the initial campaign to basically seize the major cities and or topple the government fairly quickly using airborne and mechanized operations. So both air power, landing troops, and also tanks and other things of that nature. Kiev, Kharkov, Odessa, a few other cities were probably at the very top of that list. None of those cities, of course, have fallen in the way that the Russians intended to. Limited advances, no significant change on any of those plans. So this is very interesting because a few days ago we had seen reports that the Russian Navy was steaming, full steam ahead towards Odessa, that maybe they would begin shelling Odessa. Of course, an absolute nightmare to imagine for anybody who knows the beauty and the glory that is the city of Odessa. So this doesn't seem to have happened. Whether the Russians have changed their strategy, whether they have committed their resources elsewhere, it's not entirely clear, but that hasn't happened. Kiev is, of course, still very much standing and very much in control of the Ukrainian government. So what we see then is that if Russia were taking a traditional approach, then Russia would say, the initial phase of the war has stalled. Our attempt to, have a clean and quick victory has failed. It would now be, at least according to traditional military thinking, it would now be time to have what they would call a strategic pause. And during that pause, the development of a new strategy. And in the midst of that, the gathering up of resources, the building up of resources with the intent of deploying those resources towards whatever the new objective is. This would be traditional, standard military thinking. The Russians haven't done that yet. Whether this is denial, refusal to accept the fact that the initial objectives have failed, that they have not been able to quickly decapitate the government, quickly occupy these cities, and that now they are more or less facing a protracted, very long, very bloody war. And I'll talk about Mariupol in a second, because I think Mariupol actually is probably a good indicator of where this might be going. So the Russians aren't doing what traditional military logic would have you do. Instead, they seem to be kind of offering up a strategy of limited reinforcements. So I guess wherever Russian forces are being depleted, they're kind of injecting additional resources at a very small scale, at a very localized scale. So again, what do we make of this? Is this because nobody wants to accept that they have failed in the first stage of this assault? Is it part of a broader strategic, tack by the Russians to kind of break the will, break the spirit of the Ukrainian people? I mean, this is obviously, at least on its face, failing. Ukraine, if anything, is emboldened by the fierce resistance that its military and paramilitaries have been putting up. Paramilitaries, of course, a term that includes both non-Nazis and also Nazis. I think we should be clear and be very clear about this sort of Russian propaganda about paramilitaries and Nazis and all of this. I mean, the combination, this sort of mixing and matching of these terms is very problematic because it sort of obscures the nature of Ukrainian military resistance. But anyway, I don't have time for that right now. I'll talk about Nazis in a little bit. The fall of Mariupol is a very interesting question because it hasn't fallen. This is a city that should have already long since fallen, and it hasn't. Now, is this because of the Azov battalion, the infamous Azov battalion, and some of the other regular Ukrainian military and or paramilitaries and or armed citizens who are waging this, pretty heroic resistance against the Russian military? I think it's partially that. I think it's partially the fact that the nature of the resistance has forced the Russians into a kind of block by block warfare. And that sort of urban war is really nasty, really bloody, and very slow. It's a long slog to take a city that way, as well as the United States could tell you in several of its criminal wars in recent years. All right, so the draining of resources and time in Mariupol is a big problem for the Kremlin, because this city should have already fallen. They should have already been able to move on from there to some of the other key cities. I Yeah, my pronunciation is going to be awful, but Zaporizhia and some of the other cities in that area leading towards Dnipro and some of the other population centers, those should have sort of been the dominoes that fell after Mariupol. It hasn't happened. So now it looks like the Russians seem to be scrambling to figure out, how do they move forward? Do they give up on a full takeover of Mariupol? Do they commit resources elsewhere? It seems like, and again, this is just my sort of outsider opinion here, but it seems like the Russians are conflicted and do not have a clear sense of direction as far as what they do now. So, as I said, they're committing the small groups of reinforcements, not on a large scale. If the Russians were massing tens of thousands more forces and looking to really, I mean, commit all their, chips, into the pot, as it were, commit all of their forces to the extent that they can, that would be one thing. But that's not what we're seeing. Is this, again, a strategic decision, holding resources in reserve? The next moves are not entirely clear. What I can tell you is that from all indications, we are now looking at a sort of transitional stage of this conflict, a transition from what you might call the initial push, the initial stage, the invasion, and everything that comes after that, into now a new phase that we might just call, sort of, to put it very simply, stalemate. A slow and painful and bloody daily sort of bloodletting war of attrition sort of thing. The Russians will make advances, the Ukrainians will put up resistance. Sometimes it will kind of go back and forth. You get the idea. I probably don't have to explain military stalemate. So now, what would be the next moves for the Russian military? And again, I'm sort of relying on the analysis of a number of military experts at the Institute for the Study of War. Again, not the only source in the world, but a pretty good one, as at least for the last couple of weeks they have been. So the next moves, it looks like the Russians have had some success around the city of Kherson and moving their forces north from Kherson towards very important strategic city of Kryvyi Rih, or Kryvyi Rih, I think is how you would pronounce it. And once that happens, the Russians will have made significant inroads towards the center of the country, towards sort of the heart of Ukraine, as it were. Whether that means that the Russians are going to have a real sort of strategic breakthrough that's going to fundamentally change the calculus of this war, it doesn't look that way. So anyway, that is a quick rundown of where we are today on, I guess it's the morning of March 20th now. All right, let's talk a little bit in the time that we have remaining about another very important story that came out several days ago. And I think that it is really critical that we discuss it because it really connects to everything. And that is the very important, excellent reporting from Yahoo News investigative journalists who broke the story about a CIA program in Ukraine going back to 2014. So here is what I've been talking about for weeks now. And I think I'm certainly not the only one, that Ukrainian resistance, though absolutely heroic, is not something that came out of a vacuum. This isn't just something that the Ukrainian military and special forces just found within them, out of nowhere. This was very clearly and premeditated, coordinated, and orchestrated program by the United States to essentially prepare the Ukrainian military to fight the Russians. This is, in some senses, one of many, historically, many proxy wars that the United States has used its CIA for the purposes of, its geopolitical imperatives. In this case, obviously weakening the Russians, undermining their military strategy, etc. So anyway, this program goes back to 2014. There's actually, let me be clear, there's actually several programs, right? So it's not just like one CIA program that took place in 2014 and, oh, that's it. No, this is actually something that has been ongoing since then. There was an initial phase in 2014 with an initial program that involved CIA, so-called CIA paramilitaries. Whatever that means is an interesting question that probably deserves its own segment and analysis. But paramilitaries under the auspices of the CIA, perhaps these are private military contractors, including former CIA operatives, former military, you get the idea, that were part of a program that, at least according to Yahoo News, is now no longer active. I have very significant doubts about that. But let's assume for a second that the program was going on then. It is no longer active. This would have been in Donbass. Again, this is before the Russian invasion. We're going back 8 years. The CIA sends its people into Ukraine to train the Ukrainian military, and especially their special forces and others, in various tactics. So let's talk a little bit about what it is that they were training them in and maybe how that might be showing up in what we're seeing on the battlefield. The obvious one among many is sniper tactics, the techniques that are required for effective use of snipers in a war zone. Again, we're talking about a war. We're not talking about, going out to the shooting range and seeing how far away you can hit a target or something. We're talking about how to effectively use the techniques of snipers in a war. And oh, isn't it interesting that we keep seeing reports about Russian generals and top-ranking commanders being killed on the battlefield? They're not getting shelled by random artillery. I can assure you of that. So we can already see that the programs seem to be paying some pretty significant dividends as far as U.S. strategic planners and various imperialist thinkers go. They also were helping them to train in the use of US supplied and other supplied advanced military hardware, specifically the use of Javelin anti tank missiles. Again, like I said, I'm not an expert on these, but my understanding is they're fairly complicated. It requires coordination, a team of experts to be using, these pretty advanced anti tank weapon systems. So there's a variety of roles that different people have to play in order to operate these systems effectively. They were providing the Ukrainians training in how to do that. Isn't it interesting that given that, what we know about that, and then you connect it to the fact that we hear reports that the Russians have lost perhaps up to 10% of their entire tank fleet. So supposedly they have lost upwards of 300 tanks. Whether that's true or not doesn't really matter. I mean, it could be 150, it could be 300, it could be less, it could be more. The point is they've taken significant tank losses, and we could probably attribute a good portion of those to some of this training and the use of these weapons that the Ukrainians have received. We should also mention that they provided training in the evasion of digital tracking tools. The Russians are pretty advanced as far as the use of digital tracking and other forms of surveillance. The CIA paramilitaries were providing the Ukrainians training in how to evade that, how to use covert communication systems, how to, basically communicate in secret so that the Russians couldn't intercept, and how to carry out various covert actions, including cover and move tactics for various forms of urban warfare and others. So I said there's multiple programs, though. This is the CIA program. This was in Donbass, in 2014 and in 2015. At the same time, in 2015, the United States also began a totally separate program, which was run not by the CIA, but by the US military, training Ukrainian special forces, elite military, in various tactics, including many of the same forms of training, and this was done at a Ukrainian military base in the west of the country, far from the war in Donbass, far from the front lines. So on the front lines, you have the CIA training Ukrainians. Kind of in the rear or in the western portion of the country, you have U.S. military doing that training. Now, they were providing many of the same kinds of training and also some other traditional military training as well. Now, the CIA is still training them today in 2022. According to Yahoo, in this report, the CIA is still training Ukrainian elite troops. Now, supposedly, that training is no longer taking place in Ukraine, that the CIA is carrying out this training in the United States, according to the report, at an undisclosed facility in the southern United States. I mean, we could think of a number of U.S. military bases that are infamous for this sort of thing, including anybody who follows Latin America and the School of the Americas and, the base in Georgia and all of this stuff. So, I mean, I don't have time to get into that whole history, but needless to say, the U.S. military and the CIA are together providing the training to the Ukrainian special forces and others on how to do this. Now, according to the report, the training includes firearms training, camouflage techniques, land navigation techniques, tactics like cover and move, intelligence gathering, intelligence sort of processing. Now, there's a lot to say about all of this, but I think we can sort of get the idea here. The United States is more or less directly involving itself, I shouldn't say directly, is indirectly involving itself in this war by providing this direct assistance and direct training. So a lot of talk about no-fly zones and should we arm the Ukrainians and all of this stuff, it sort of obscures the fact that we're already doing that and have been doing that for quite a long time. And again, this gets back to Putin's narratives about war with the West, war with the United States. And maybe he doesn't use that terminology, but it is strongly implied that the war in Ukraine is, in essence, a war against NATO and a war against the United United States. That is how it is presented in Russia to a large extent. And things like the CIA providing this sort of training certainly bolsters that narrative. Does it mean that what Putin's claims are true? Of course not. It doesn't mean that, but it does mean that this sort of assistance has not only been provided, I would argue it is one of the direct reasons for why Ukrainian resistance has been so fierce. This is to take nothing away from the courage and heroism of regular Ukrainian citizens who have taken up arms, regular Ukrainian military, special forces, all of them that have fought against a much larger and much stronger enemy. It is not to take away anything from them. It is to say that this is how it is happening, and this is why it is happening, and this is what we need to understand, because we're interested in reality. We're interested in the truth. We're not interested in the Kremlin's propaganda or the US propaganda. I'm not interested in people photoshopping Zelensky's head onto Captain America's body. I'm not interested in Putin's narratives and distortions about Nazis. We have to be real and honest about what's happening, and one of the things that's happening is that the CIA and the US military are deeply involved. Okay, we are out of time. Oh dear, I want to talk about China and China's sort of nervousness about its alliance with Russia. There's so much to say about that, including what the Chinese banks are up to. The very interesting piece in Foreign Affairs called "The Case for Ukrainian Neutrality." I would argue that that's probably one of the more important pieces you might come across in the next couple of days. Also, the U.S. is, of course, arming insurgents, because why wouldn't we? That's what we do, isn't it? And a very interesting New York Times article about Nazis as justification for this war. The way that Putin uses the narrative, and let me just say, at the risk of somebody saying whataboutism and that I'm engaging in whataboutism, I do find it interesting what a blind spot the New York Times has when it talks about Russia distorting the reality and using the word Nazis, and doesn't seem to think that the United States did the same thing with the word terrorists. But hey, that's for another segment. I don't have time for that. If you want to go over to the Patreon, patreon.com/Eric Draitser. I have so much more to discuss there, those stories and a lot more. Thanks for the support. Talk to you again next time.